He didn't just rule an empire. He turned desire into a weapon. What follows are the palace mechanisms, the ritualized spectacles, and the reports from ancient annals that insist Caligula used intimacy itself as a tool of domination. This episode discusses historical reports of sexual coercion and humiliation. In 37 CE, a young heir stepped into a throne crowded with memory and excess. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, the man history would remember by the nickname Caligula, inherited an empire rich in ritual, protocol, and private codes of honor. Rome already tolerated extravagance. It preserved for the elite certain unwritten rules about dignity. According to contemporary chronologies, Caligula's accession transformed those rules into instruments of statecraft. He reigned only 4 years, but his methods left lasting damage. If you love deep dives into the darker corners of ancient history, subscribe for more. Ancient historians such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio record these episodes. Later accounts amplified some details. Where sources disagree, I'll present both the claim and the skepticism. Much that we will say is reported, alleged, or disputed, and yet even the disputes reveal something about a regime that weaponized shame and desire against its own citizens. Caligula's story begins with inheritance, not just of power, but of trauma. He came of age in a household where violence, exile, and sudden reversals shaped expectation. The political culture of the late Julio-Claudian family was one where survival meant being ready to humiliate, betray, or be betrayed. Ancient sources paint a childhood threaded with loss, family members removed by imperial suspicion, relatives executed or imprisoned. Those patterns of intimidation, historians argue, offered a grim tutoring in how domination worked. We should be cautious about turning these biographical fragments into a modern medical verdict. Some scholars read paranoia or cruel ingenuity into his actions. Others warn that the stories themselves, written after his death, reflect the taste for scandal. Still, there is continuity. A ruler who had watched power consume kin might come to see total domination, even of the body, as the ultimate security. The palace, in Caligula's hands, ceased to be merely a residence. It became a stage, a theater of power where every object and corridor could be reconfigured to humiliate or to manipulate. Anecdotes speak of hidden passages and private galleries, corridors that allowed the emperor to enter rooms unseen. Imagine marbled halls lit by oil lamps, curtains drawn, and soft-footed servants moving between mirrored chambers. In such spaces, personal boundaries could be erased not by force alone, but by the architecture of surprise. Suetonius and Cassius Dio suggest that the palace's layout, the intimate networks of rooms and servants, was a tool. If a noble family was to be punished, it could begin with a summons to a private supper. A summons, in this context, was rarely neutral. Acceptance meant compliance. Refusal could be read as a political challenge. The logic was brutal and precise. To accept an imperial request was to consent under duress. To refuse was to invite reprisal. Either way, honor was at stake, and honor in Roman elite culture was everything. Banquets, by design, offered perfect theater for humiliation. Picture a long table of shifting candlelight, marble candelabra, velvet or crimson cloths spread across silver. Caligula, or so the stories go, staged dinners where private status was publicly rewritten. Men and women of the highest rank could be singled out, presented, ridiculed, or forced into degrading visibility. Senatorial dignity, built on neat protocols of deference and privacy, was not merely offended. It was systematically dismantled. Ancient sources claim varied details. Suetonius writes of dinners where Caligula's questions and pranks crossed into more sinister territory. A man could be unmasked, a scandal rehearsed, a woman taken from the table. Cassius Dio contributes a picture of an emperor who treated intimacy as currency, demanding public acts that blurred the line between display and coercion. We must remember, these accounts were written by authors who loved a good anecdote, and later writers amplified the salacious. Yet the convergence of these testimonies suggests a pattern: banquets used as instruments of intimidation. But that was only the beginning. According to some reports, Caligula converted parts of the palace into what later chroniclers describe as an imperial brothel, not a cloistered secret, but an arrangement with political utility. The allegation is striking and, if taken at face value, chilling. Rooms that generated revenue also generated leverage. If a man from a noble family found his daughter, sister, or wife conscripted into such a space, what recourse did he have? Public shame, ruin, could be weaponized. The accusation that the emperor profited from the prostitution of the elite is charged in more ways than one. It speaks to fiscal policy, to personal depravity, and above all, to the conversion of human bodies into fiscal and political instruments. We must push against certainty here. The claim that the palace functioned as a state-run brothel appears in later sources and is debated by modern historians. Some argue that the notion might have been exaggerated by enemies and gossip. But even as rumor, the idea served a rhetorical purpose. It crystallized the fear that the emperor could turn the private lives of elites into instruments of his authority. Whether administratively true or not, the accusation tells us how contemporaries and successors imagined the reach of his power. Caligula's theater extended beyond banquets and alleged brothels into the cult of the emperor's own body. Sources tell of statues, of nakedness as spectacle, and of rooms that made mirrors into altars. The emperor, it is claimed, demanded worship, sometimes by literal elevation to divine status, and sometimes by staged scenes of self-exposure. Statues and images of himself proliferated. Mirrors multiplied the emperor's image until rooms became altars of reflection. In that light, draped flesh, lacquered rooms, and sculpted forms were not mere vanity. They were tools designed to remake reverence into submission. One of the most persistent allegations concerns Drusilla, Caligula's sister. According to Suetonius and other sources, Drusilla occupied a position that went beyond familial affection. She was exceptional in the emperor's favor and received honors akin to deification. Some accounts suggest that Caligula declared her a goddess in life and placed her image beside his own. Ancient gossip went further, alleging an intimacy that crossed the bounds of acceptable conduct. Here again, the language must be careful. These are charged reports, and ancient chroniclers used sexual scandal to mark moral collapse. Whether the relationship was corrupt, political, or both, the elevation of a sister to quasi-divine status functioned as an explicit affront to Roman norms, and an assertion of the emperor's right to rewrite religious and familial rules. The politics of favoritism cut both ways. For some, proximity to the emperor meant protection and privilege. For others, it meant exposure and exploitation. Caligula's manipulations of familial ties, exalting one sister while humiliating another, sent a clear message. Access could be fatal for honor, and favor could be indistinguishable from weaponry. Ancient sources record episodes of exile and punishment leveled against women of the imperial household, acts that were read by contemporaries as capricious cruelty. There is a darker logic beneath these anecdotes. Honor in Roman society was not merely a private asset. It was public standing, legal leverage, and political currency. To strip someone of honor, through public shaming or forced exposure, was to strip them of a public life. Caligula's alleged practices degraded the social fabric by making insecurity the norm. Senators who had once negotiated power through networks of mutual respect found themselves vulnerable to arbitrary spectacle. The cumulative effect was political damage. When the elite lives under constant threat of humiliation, alliances fray. Ambition turns to paranoia. The Praetorian Guard, entrusted with the emperor's protection, watched as the center of power became unpredictable. Among the guard was a man named Cassius Chaerea, a figure who appears in several accounts as central to the plot that ended Caligula's life. The motives attributed to him and his cohorts range from personal revenge for insults to a broader sense of civic duty. The assassination was explained as a final attempt to restore dignity to an offended Rome. The violence of the coup is stark in its symbolism. On January 24th, 41 CE, Caligula was murdered in the very house of power he had reshaped into a theater of control. Contemporary reports describe the murder as an intimate act of revenge by men who had grown tired of being publicly mocked, humiliated, or otherwise rendered impotent by imperial whim. The killing was not merely a political calculation. In many accounts, it was the end of a reign that had transformed intimacy into a weapon and found, finally, that those it had wounded could strike back. The aftermath is instructive. The Senate, the Guard, and the people scrambled to restore order. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, would succeed to the throne in an uncertain moment that exposed how fragile the machinery of personal rule could be. But more lasting than the immediate political rearrangement was the lesson about power and social norms. When a ruler corrodes the institutions that generate mutual recognition, the rituals of honor, the privacy of the elite, the boundaries between public and private, the social code that preserves status collapses. Caligula's techniques, ancient writers suggested, did not merely punish individuals. They weakened the very conventions that kept the elite invested in a shared system of governance. That is the sobering part of the shocking practices we have catalogued. The lurid details, the claimed brothel, the banquet humiliations, the cult of the emperor's body, are attention-grabbing. But their force as historical evidence lies in what they reveal about the rhetoric of control and the methods of domination. Even if later historians amplified specific episodes, the pattern of rumor and complaint itself tells a political story. A ruler who weaponized desire risked igniting the social bonds he needed to rule. There is another layer, a cultural reading of sources. Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century, and Cassius Dio, writing later, were both shaped by Roman tastes for anecdote and moralizing history. They used sexual scandal to signify moral failure. Where they differ, modern historians must read between lines. Sometimes an episode functions less as literal reportage and more as a symbol that communicates civic anxiety. The persistence of these stories, even as they are tempered by doubts, shows how power that seeks to erase boundaries always invites narrative retaliation. We should be clear on one more point of caution. Ancient accusations of incest, rape, or systemic brothels often carried moral weight beyond their evidentiary basis. To call a ruler's behavior monstrous is to echo contemporary condemnation. As careful readers, we mark allegations as such. According to Suetonius, some accounts say, Cassius Dio records, "We do not present every lurid claim as incontrovertible fact. Yet reporting the accusation and its consequences is necessary because, in Roman terms, accusation shaped reality. To be accused in the imperial age could be to lose life, property, or lineage. What remains incontrovertible is the cultural shock. Caligula's reign, short as it was, produced stories that resonated across generations. The image of an emperor who turned private bodies into public instruments captured imaginations because it inverted a fundamental expectation, that the emperor protects the dignity of his subjects. When that expectation reversed, the result was social disintegration. There is an ethical dimension too. Reading these accounts asks us to look at the human cost behind the scandal. Behind the palace's velvet curtains were people whose reputations, families, and futures were jeopardized. Whether charges were fully accurate or partly slanderous, the mechanisms of rumor and coercion inflicted real harm. The elite, who had once wielded honor as a shield, learned vulnerability in a new register, and their reaction consolidated into the violence that removed the emperor. So what does this teach us beyond antiquarian appetite for the grotesque? It highlights a political truth that is neither ancient nor remote. Leaders who weaponize intimacy and shame against their own social base unleash a corrosive force. Social trust, norms, and mutual recognition are fragile. When they fracture, the system becomes brittle and dangerous. Caligula's story is not simply about the excesses of a single ruler. It is a cautionary tale about the weaponization of the private for political ends. As we close, remember the historian's caveat. The most salacious claims are often the most amplified, and all sources must be read critically. Yet the pattern that emerges, of banquets turned to humiliation, of reputation used as leverage, of spectacle replacing law, is supported across testimonies. Those are the practices that make the title true, not because we can verify every detail, but because the accumulated reports reveal a consistent tactic, turning human intimacy into a method of rule. Caligula reigned only 4 years, but his methods left lasting damage. The most shocking behaviors attributed to him are shocking not simply as tales of depravity, but as evidence of a system that treated people as instruments. When rulers convert the private into a public instrument of domination, they do more than commit abuses. They dissolve the social codes that support a political order. If this shocked you, like and share, and tell us in the comments which historical figure you want us to unmask next.